between the phonological rules of different languages. So for example, in Mandarin Chinese, pitch is very important tracking pitch is very important when you're defining words. And to add words to your vocabulary, to learn new words, you have to be sensitive to pitch. So you can't really afford to override pitch variation when you're learning new words. So how do Mandarin Chinese English bilingual infants, how do they perform at these word recognition tasks when there's pitch variation between familiarization and test that may correspond to tone variation in one of their languages but not in the other? So this is a study with 48 Mandarin English bilingual infants at 3 different age groups. And the rationale for these age groups is there seems to be changes across between 7 and 11 months in terms of infants' capacities to generalize across pitch variation. So infants were trained on English words in one experiment, and then they were tested in Chinese. They were trained on a word, say, in tone 2, and then they were presented with that word in tone 4 in a Chinese experiment, and then they were exposed to a similar pitch transformation in English. So what you find is the green bars are control bars, so those are the bars against which the blue bars are being compared. And what you find is at 7 months, infants only recognize words that are matched in pitch in English and only recognize words that are matched in tone in Mandarin Chinese. So this is a very good strategy for learning Mandarin Chinese, but not a good strategy for learning English. By 9 months, they seem to do the opposite, so things seem to have shifted, and they recognize words, whether they're matched or mismatched in tone, so they equate tonal variance in Mandarin Chinese, and they generalize across pitch transformations in English. They seem to collapse across words that contrast in pitch, whether that contrast is lexically relevant or not. But by 11 months, which is quite young in terms of the life of an infant or a language learner, they're already showing language-specific capabilities. So by 11 months, they have different strategies for different languages, and their word recognition abilities are closely aligned with the phonological particulars of the language that they're hearing. So before a bilingual child even begins to amass much of a productive vocabulary, they seem to be well positioned to account for variation based on its relevance in their language. So I'm a bit short on time, so I think I'll skip the next experiment and get to talking about multilingualism. Okay. So in terms of early bilingualism, there's been a lot of work looking at the consequences of bilingualism for cognition. And much of this work has revealed what's called a bilingual advantage in terms of changes in the way in which you process information that have been attributed to learning multiple languages. So there are many demonstrations of this in adults. For example, adults are better at driving in a driving simulator while they talk on their cell phone without crashing if they're bilingual versus if they're multilingual. So there are many examples of bilinguals having improved abilities or enhanced abilities to manage competing stimuli. And this has also been shown in children. So in preschool children and school-age children, if children are asked to do something like the dimensional card sorting task, where they're asked to sort these objects based on color, and then the rules change on them, and they're asked to now sort them based on shape, bilingual children are better able to inhibit the previously learned set of rules and adapt to a new set of rules than their monolingual peers. So for a long time, the bilingual advantage was thought to be the result of years of producing 2 languages and always having to inhibit one language when you select your other language. You're always having to suppress one language in order to when you're choosing the language, and this was thought to sort of sharpen an important area of cognition called inhibitory control, which fuels performance in these kinds of tasks. But recently there have been 2 interesting studies showing an infant bilingual advantage, suggesting that before children even begin to produce their 2 languages, they seem to show, there seem to be cognitive privileges associated with bilingualism. So these are very striking findings because they suggest that the bilingual advantage may be revealed by mere exposure to two languages and not simply contingent upon production. So in the first experiment, Kovacs and Miller found that children who are bilingual are better able to master two inconsistent grammatical systems than monolingual peers. And this makes sense because as a bilingual child, you're always trying to master inconsistent systems, but it's striking that this is observable so early in development. And even earlier in development and even further removed from language, the same investigators found that bilingual children outperform monolingual children in what's called the A-0-B error. So the A-0-B error is a task where a baby is introduced to a novel object or an interesting object, and that object is put in one container and hidden from view, and the child is expected to reach for the object, so the child reaches for the object. After a number of trials, the object is then moved to the other container, and the child can see the move, and then the child is asked to retrieve the object, and the A-0-B error is going for the original location even though you saw the object, the displacement of the object. And so bilingual children are less prone to the A-0-B error at 7 months of age than monolingual children. So this feeds into the idea that bilingual children have advantages in inhibitory control, but that these advantages show up very, very early in development. So I was interested in whether the infant bilingual advantage is something that's even more fundamental or even more elemental in terms of information processing. So I'm going to present a study looking at bilingualism and visual habituation. So one of the most commonly used methods in infant cognition is visual habituation, which is basically the idea that if you see something repeatedly, it gets boring after a while, and you show a decline in attention or investment in looking at the things that you're seeing. So it's basically a decline in attention due to repeated presentation of a stimulus. One example of visual habituation experiment would be that an infant sees trial after trial of this rabbit. And initially they're very interested because it's novel and appealing, and then on the second trial their fixation time may decrease, and then it continues to decrease with successive presentations of the same stimulus, so it gets boring for them. And then you present them with a novel stimulus, and you expect to see a rise in attention in response to this novel stimulus. So there are often two things that are interesting in visual habituation experiments. One is the habituation function. So you can see that this function is quite gradual, whereas this function is very steep. So it's thought that children who show steep functions are rapid information processors, and it seems that that means something for how they develop later. So visual habituation or fast habituators show enhanced symbolic play abilities. They show higher vocabularies at age 2. And so it's basically a measure of simple learning in infancy. The second measure that's interesting is how they respond to the change in stimulus. So what does their novelty preference look like when they see something different? We looked at 6-month-old infants, and I should mention this is part of the Gusto study. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the study, but Singapore has a large-scale birth cohort where infants are being tracked from when the mothers, from the beginning of the pregnancy to when the children are 10 years old. So the children are about 3 years old now. So we looked at children when they were 6 months old on a visual habituation experiment, looking at using a bear and a wolf. So infants were habituated to the wolf, and then they would see a picture of the bear, or they were habituated to the bear, and then they'd see a picture of the wolf. And we're interested to see whether bilingual children look similar to monolingual children at 6 months of age on this experiment. So we looked at habituation behavior, but also test behavior. So I'll present some of the results here, but basically bilingual children at 6 months showed steeper habituation functions, so they showed sharper slopes, so they habituated more rapidly than monolingual children. And they also showed a larger decrement in attention from the beginning of the habituation phase to the end of the habituation phase. So bilingual children approximate what is thought of as being a fast habituator in infant visual habituation. And what's important is that overall fixation times didn't differ by group. What differs is not overall attention, but the distribution of attention across the habituation session. In terms of recognition memory, when an infant's habituated to a wolf and then they're presented with a picture of a bear, how do they respond? What proportion of their looking is devoted to that bear, the novel stimulus, compared to the wolf? So only bilingual children showed above chance fixation to the novel stimulus, and monolingual children did not. So there seem to be differences in how rapidly information is processed in the bilingual sample versus the monolingual sample, but also in how infants react to a change in stimulus, so recognition memory for the habituation stimulus. So before, another question that we were interested in asking is, what is a bilingual? So in the field of bilingualism, bilinguals are defined as individuals who have between 25 and 30% of exposure to a second language. But many people have, say, 5% of exposure or 10% exposure, so they're second language exposed, but they wouldn't qualify as a bilingual. So if we resample the original set of infants and then bring an infant to a second language exposed but wouldn't be classified as bilinguals, are there changes in habituation behavior based on how much exposure you have to a second language? In other words, is the bilingual advantage sort of dose dependent, or does it not matter? Is it a kind of a threshold effect where once you cross that threshold, you look different from a group of children who don't cross that threshold? So we looked at the amount of second language exposure relative to a habituation factor, which is a factor that takes advantage of the fact that slope, decrement, and baseline, three habituation variables, tend to be highly correlated, and were also highly correlated in this sample, and therefore can be reduced into a single composite variable. So what you see is that there's an association between the amount of exposure you have to your second language at 6 months and the speed with which you process information in the habituation phase of this experiment. So these results suggest that the infant bilingual advantage, as shown also by Kovacs and Miller, is early to emerge. It seems to be observable in tasks that don't involve linguistic stimuli, so in a visual memory task, and that might be more remote from language compared to other tasks that have been previously used. And it may be more basic in form than previously assumed. So it may not be something that only manifests itself in inhibitory control tasks or tasks that involve the executive system, but it may show up in tasks that involve more basic forms of information processing. And it might be something where there's a dose, it may be that there's a dose-response relationship versus a simple threshold effect, as previously assumed. So it may be that there are bilingual advantages that are proportionate to the amount of exposure you have to your second language. Okay, this is my last point. So I just wanted to end on this quote, which I think is a very nice quote by Bialystok and Hakuda, that talks about why there might be an interesting bilingual advantage, which is that the enriching aspect of bilingualism may follow directly from its most maddening complication, and it's precisely because the structures and concepts of different languages never coincide that the experience of learning a second language is so spectacular in its effects. Okay, so I'd also like to acknowledge people in my lab and also the Gusto project and NUS funding. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Leher. I'd like to invite both of our speakers for this morning's session to come up and have a seat. And most importantly, I'd like to invite members of the audience to ask our speakers some questions about their presentations. I'll stay here, that's fine.
Thank you. Sorry, I have two questions for two professors each. First, I would like to ask Professor Spelke that you talk about